The pilots of Brazilian Flight 2283 had just received clearance to land, but an alarm blared in the cockpit. The plane started swaying violently, and the passengers grew anxious. However, in the cockpit, real panic had set in. Their ATR-72 suddenly lost lift at an altitude of over 5,000 meters and spiraled out of control. Dozens of people on board and on the ground watched in horror for nearly a minute as the doomed plane plummeted toward a densely populated area. Yet its fate was sealed 30 years earlier. To understand why, we'll need to delve into more than one deadly aviation disaster. So, viewer discretion is advised. It was August 9th, 2024. Dr. Adriano Assis had just finished his shift and was rushing to the airport in Cascavel, Brazil, hoping to catch the morning Voipass Flight 2283 to Guarulhos. At first, there was no one at the check-in desk, and by the time Assis grabbed a coffee, a long line had formed. When he finally made it to his gate, boarding had already ended. He begged to be let on, then argued and demanded. Yet all he heard was that he could take the evening flight instead. Furious, Assis, exhausted after a grueling shift, had to spend the whole day stuck in the airport. What he didn't yet know was how lucky he actually turned out to be. Meanwhile, 10 other passengers of Flight 2283 were waiting at the wrong gate after some confusion. By the time they realized the mistake, it was too late. Captain Danilo Santos Romano and First Officer Humberto de Campos Alencar took off at 11:58 a.m. with 62 people on board, leaving over 11 empty seats. The entire flight was supposed to take just an hour and a half, and everything went smoothly. Exactly 1 hour and 20 minutes after takeoff, the pilots of Flight 2283 requested landing clearance and got it. The passengers, already preoccupied with their post-landing plans, were unaware of the impending disaster. Two kids were eagerly peeking out the windows, watching the land emerge through the clouds. The plane began to turn right when suddenly it shook violently, and the pilots saw the stall alert go off. In simple terms, this meant the plane's wings were no longer generating lift. In other words, they weren't doing their job, and the massive structure, packed with people, could no longer keep itself in the air. The next 2 minutes were filled with terror for everyone aboard Flight 2283. At 1:20 p.m., the plane was at an altitude of 5,180 meters. For 10 seconds, it seemed to drop into a 75-meter pit, only to bounce back up nearly 50 meters higher than where it started. The pilots were desperately fighting to keep the aircraft airborne, but ultimately lost all control. Alarmed residents of the municipality of Venedo watched as the plane, slowly rotating, descended from the sky. In the next moment, a woman, peacefully having lunch at home, dropped to the floor and started praying. She had just seen it crash into the house next door. Everything within dozens of meters was scattered with fiery debris. Luis Augusto de Oliveira clutched his chest as he watched the wrecked plane burn on his property. It had crashed onto his garage and garden, not the house where Oliveira, his wife, and their maid were when the disaster struck. It was a miracle, but not for those on board. The plane had turned into a fiery, twisted mass of metal, impossible to approach. When the firefighters arrived, it became clear that no one on board could have survived. Meanwhile, back at the Cascavel airport, the 11 passengers who had missed Flight 2283 found out about the crash. Dr. Adriano Assis, who had been furious about spending his day at the airport, was now thanking God and the airline worker who didn't let him on board. All 62 people on the flight had perished. It was a national tragedy and became Brazil's 5th deadliest aviation disaster. But the question was, why did it happen? Experts quickly arrived at the crash site. Some dismantled the engines for analysis, while others searched for the black boxes. Fortunately, they were intact, raising hopes of discovering the cause of the crash. The flight was operated by a twin-engine turboprop ATR 72-500, a 14-year-old plane, which is a standard age for an aircraft. The crew was highly competent and had sent no distress signals. However, while experts were investigating the evidence, journalists quickly uncovered a potential cause. A photo of the plane's control panel, supposedly from this ill-fated ATR 72-500, a year before the crash, surfaced online. More people wouldn't know what to look for in the image, but if you're a pilot or closely connected to the industry, you'd immediately notice the yellow sticker on the panel. It indicated that one of the instruments was temporarily out of order, and on the plane that operated Flight 2283, a year before the crash, part of the anti-icing system had been tagged. That's not all though. Journalists also found a photo from another ATR-72-500 showing the same system malfunctioning. It turned out that small, seemingly insignificant technical issues were common on planes of this series. One had a faulty fuel level indicator, while another had the performance monitor handle break off mid-flight. Both of these components are critical for determining a plane's weight and are connected to detecting ice buildup on the aircraft. After these photos surfaced, experts suspected that malfunctions in the anti-icing system were the likely cause of the crash. Moreover, they noticed an eerie similarity between the crash of Brazil's Flight 2283 and the American Flight 4184. It was October 31st, 1994. Despite the rainy and chilly weather, people across the U.S. were rushing to prepare for Halloween, eager to spend time with family and friends. Partly because of the holiday, American Eagle Flight 4184 from Indianapolis to Chicago was full. 64 passengers boarded, looked after by 2 flight attendants. The senior attendant, Sandy, and the junior attendant, Amanda, who was working her very first day on the job. That day, the cockpit was occupied by Captain Orlando Aguirre and First Officer Jeff Galliano, both young yet experienced pilots with thousands of hours logged on the ATR-72. Their plane was practically the same model as the one that crashed in Brazil in 2024. Flight 4184 was scheduled to depart at 2:10 p.m. and land 65 minutes later. However, when the pilots requested clearance for takeoff, the controller told them to wait without explaining why. As a result, the plane took off 45 minutes late, which wasn't a big deal. In fact, pilots can often make up for lost time in the air, but not this time. The crew had to repeatedly climb and descend, reaching an altitude of nearly 5,000 meters. This didn't take extra time, but led to ice forming on the plane, so the pilots activated all anti-icing systems. On the ATR-72, these systems include de-icing boot, ribbed rubber tube on the front edges of the wings, and stabilizers that inflates and breaks off accumulated ice. Now, why is this important? Even a thin layer of ice on a wing can reduce lift by a quarter, decreasing speed, increasing fuel consumption, and make the plane more difficult to control, possibly even leading to a complete loss of control. It's clear why the crew activated the anti-icing system as soon as they saw ice forming on the plane. What happened next, however, is harder to understand. At 3:18 p.m., the pilots descended and requested clearance to land in Chicago. They were told to wait because air traffic was too heavy and there wasn't enough space. So, Flight 4184 climbed back up and began circling in the assigned holding pattern. With nothing to do while waiting, the junior flight attendant, Amanda, entered the cockpit and started asking the pilots about their work. They eagerly explained the plane's systems to her and even turned on various warning signals for her to hear. All of this was recorded by the black box. The pilots possibly became so engrossed in their conversation that they missed the actual ice accumulation warning. However, the warning repeated later, and the crew reactivated the de-icing boots. Only half an hour later, Flight 4184 finally cleared to begin its descent. As soon as the pilots attempted to descend, all hell broke loose. A series of loud bangs echoed through the plane. The autopilot disengaged, and the aircraft sharply rolled to the right. The captain yanked the control column back and briefly stabilized the plane for a second. But the wings had lost lift. The nose dipped, and the ATR-72 hurtled toward the ground. The pilots did everything possible to stabilize the plane again, but the overload was critical. The last thing the pilots heard was the crunch of the wings and tail tearing off in midair. And the last thing they saw was a field rushing toward them at an unimaginable speed of 695 kilometers per hour. The impact was so powerful that the fuselage was ripped into tiny pieces. The only recognizable parts were the tail and wings, which had detached in midair. Tragically, all 68 people on board lost their lives. Even months after the disaster, farmers were still finding not just plane debris at the crash site. Experts conducted a thorough investigation and determined that the cause of the crash was icing. While the plane was circling and waiting to land, ice accumulated beyond the reach of the de-icing boots, and nothing could be done. Essentially, gravity ripped Flight 4184 from the sky. Although the crew made several serious mistakes, this crash called into question the safety of ATR-72 aircraft. After the disaster, new rules and restrictions were introduced for pilots, and the aircraft manufacturer increased the de-icing boot coverage from 7 to 12.5%. But there was more. All ATR-72 planes were moved to regions where severe icing was not an issue. Could the fate of Brazilian Flight 2283 be sealed 30 years before the crash because of a reluctance to truly address a serious problem? Icing is indeed one of the most critical challenges in civil aviation. Any neglect of this rule inevitably leads to fatal consequences. The largest aviation disaster in the history of the French company Air France, and for the Airbus A330, also occurred because of icing. Flight 447 operated regular service between Rio de Janeiro and Paris. The aircraft performing this flight, on May 31, 2009, had undergone a major overhaul and was only 4 years old. The pilots had logged thousands of hours on this model, and the rest of the crew was also experienced. The first third of the flight went smoothly until the plane flew over the Atlantic Ocean. It encountered a thunderstorm at an altitude of nearly 10,700 meters. At minus 45 degrees Celsius, rain droplets started turning into crystals and sticking to the plane's exterior and sensors. Eventually, ice blocked the so-called pitot tubes, which measured the aircraft's speed. The onboard systems began receiving inaccurate data, causing the autopilot to shut off. Despite their experience, the crew was unable to respond quickly, and ultimately, Flight 447 fell into the ocean. All 228 people on board perished. It seemed that this tragedy would definitely change aviation. New safety rules, pilot instructions, and sensors were introduced. But if the Brazilian flight crashed under the same circumstances, did these measures really work? Although ice might not even be the issue here, unlike the previous mentioned pitot tubes. Because as far back as 1996, it became clear how vulnerable they were. The discussion now turns to Flight 301 of Birgenair. This is the largest aviation disaster in the history of the Dominican Republic, and for the Boeing 757. In February 1996, this model operated Flight 301 from Puerto Plata in the Dominican Republic to Frankfurt, Germany. Most of the 176 passengers were Germans returning from their long-awaited annual vacation. In addition to them, there were 13 crew members on board. Shortly after takeoff, the captain noticed that the speed indicator on the panel was not functioning. But for some reason, he continued the flight anyway. This was a mistake because soon after, a warning system was activated, indicating that the Boeing was flying critically slow. And, as in previous cases, the autopilot suddenly shut off, and the plane entered an uncontrollable descent. The pilots couldn't do anything, and the plane, along with all 189 people on board, crashed into the sea. No one survived. The investigation was long and complicated, but one thing became clear. Ice had nothing to do with it. However, one of the 3 pitot tubes was transmitting incorrect readings. And most likely, the cause was wasps. While the plane was parked for 20 days in the hangar, the insects had built a nest inside. And if you thought this was a unique case, it wasn't. Apart from the Dominican Republic, similar situations have occurred in London, Brisbane, and the southern United States. But what about Flight 2283? After all these catastrophes, had nothing changed by 2024? On September 6th, a preliminary report containing the collected data on the crash was released. It was revealed that early in the flight, the captain spoke about a malfunction in the de-icing system. Yet this was not confirmed by the plane's data systems. And just 2 minutes before the crash, the first officer warned about a significant amount of ice. Moreover, the anti-icing boots had been activated several times. At one point, for 6 minutes, the plane sounded a warning about icing, yet the pilots did not activate the system. Could it be that it wasn't working? But then, why wasn't an emergency declared on board? There are no answers to these questions yet. Still, one thing is sure. The plane was covered in ice, and something or someone failed in their duties, preventing this story from ending differently.